right, so as I mentioned, the first 6 verses are kind of a block together in my assessment. I'm also going to jump down. I don't know why I have, yeah, I got the wrong verse there. Oh, nope, there it is. I'm also going to jump down and add verse 17 with these first 6 verses because verse 17 introduces another category to get all 4 categories, and then we'll talk about verses 7 through 15, which is about the offerings in response to these things. And so he begins, if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration to testify, when he is a witness, whether he has seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, then he will bear his guilt. And I'm going to stop right there. We need to talk about this verse just a little bit, so make sure we're all on the same page and understand exactly what he's talking about. Anybody want to take a stab at what the sin is here? It's not actually. It's unintentional. Okay, sort of, yeah. Now, it's important to note in the middle, when he is a witness, okay, means he's seen something. But then it says, whether he's seen it or otherwise known. So there's also apparently another way that you might be able to testify beyond eyewitness testimony, where you have knowledge. I would say, and this is not an exclusive illustration, this is just a type that would fall into this category. Let's say that we own businesses and we hire an accounting firm to handle things for us. And in the process of them doing the accounting for us, they uncover that we've done something that is not lawful. Okay, they didn't see us do it, but they have the evidence and they know that we did it. Okay, so there's somebody who's a witness, though not an eyewitness, but still with absolute knowledge. And that's what he's talking about here. So the idea is this, here's where the problem comes in. And to me, the key is after he hears a public adjuration. All right, adjuration is a really common word that we use all the time. What does that mean, a public adjuration? Right. So there's been a request. And this happens all the time in our own society. Some crime has happened. The authorities come out and say to the public, if anyone has any information about what happened, please let us know. That's a public adjuration for witnesses to come forward who have knowledge. That's what makes you a witness. Not who have guesses, not who have gut feelings, not who, I don't like Sheila, so I'm going to go tell him that Sheila did something wrong. No, people who know that something wrong has happened. There's been a public call for you to share that knowledge, and you don't do it. Then he will bear his guilt. Yes. It could be, but in this case, I wouldn't say it has to be. And as we get into this chapter, it'll become very clear that all of these are about unintentional things, because when we get to the offering stage, it will say when you become aware. So we've got this first failure to testify about something that's known. Now, in our system, we have some exceptions to those obligations. The most famous one being a spouse. A spouse is never obligated to give testimony against their spouse. There's some other exceptions to the rule as well. We also generally don't have it set up as necessarily being illegal to not say anything, although I could argue that it's obstruction. But doesn't necessarily mean that someone who doesn't say anything is going to get prosecuted in our system. Under the Jewish system, at least here, there's no exceptions made at all. If you know about something and there's been a request for you to testify and you don't do it, you're guilty. You have an obligation. Then he leads into the next one. Or, this is verse 2, if a person touches any unclean thing, whether a carcass of an unclean beast, or the carcass of unclean cattle, or the carcass of an unclean swarming thing, though it is hidden from him, and he is unclean, then he will be guilty. Does it matter that you didn't know? No. If you touch an unclean thing, you're unclean and you're guilty. Or if he touches human uncleanness. Now, this one is a whole lot easier for me to grasp, you not knowing. I guess you can make a false identification of a thing. You think it's a clean animal and you touch it and you find out it's not. You realize after the fact that it's actually an unclean animal. I don't know. That one is hard for me to conceptualize it being unintentional and unknown. Maybe if it's a moving object and you brush against it, that can be unintentional. But anyway, human uncleanness is a whole lot more potential because an unclean person touching an unclean person causes you to be unclean. You might not realize that person is unclean. So, if he touches a human uncleanness of whatever sort, his uncleanness may be with which he becomes unclean, and it is hidden from him, you're not aware, and then he comes to know it, he will be guilty. And there's where we get this first, and we're going to see this several times in this book, where something is done, it's not known when it's done, but when you become aware, there's obligations of response. Now, that doesn't mean that in between it happening and in between your response, it's not a problem. So you're unclean this whole time, but you're not obligated to do what it's going to tell you to do until you're aware that you're unclean. All right. Or, verse 4, if a person swears thoughtlessly with his lips to do evil or to do good in whatever matter, a man may speak thoughtlessly with an oath, and it is hidden from him, then he comes to know it. He will be guilty in one of those. All right, this one I want to spend a little time on. This one's a little more difficult. How can you make an oath, swear thoughtlessly, and it be hidden from you? And what is it talking about anyway, about swearing thoughtlessly, making an oath that is thoughtless? Rash is a good word. Rash just means hasty, without thinking through. Not a prophet, but you're close. A judge. And that is the example that just screams the example of this situation. So if you want to drop a ribbon marker here, flip over to Judges 11 for a moment. And I want to read with you from Judges 11, an account that we've studied before, but just to refresh everybody's mind in the situation, because this is a textbook example of what this is talking about. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now, clearly, he's thinking an animal is going to run out. But that's not what happens. So the story goes on. So Jephthah crossed over to the Amorites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them to his hand. And he struck them from Aror to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 cities as far as Abel Kiraman, with a great blow. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. And Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him. With tambourines and with dances, she was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, this is important, as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes. That is an action of remorse. He knows the promise that he made. It's not that he don't know the promise. He didn't know the consequence of the promise. That's how it's rash. That's how it's thoughtless, not having considered. See, taking a step back, you say, the best of my flocks I will offer you. But he's thinking at the time that he is saying, look, I'm not going to be choosing what I give you. Whatever comes to me, whatever it is, however much it costs me, whatever it is, it's my favorite pet milk cow. Well, that's what I'm going to offer you. He's not thinking it through. The minute he sees his daughter, he says, oh no. Now he's aware of the consequences of his vow. It goes on to say, he tore his clothes and said, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble to me, for I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. Now, a lot of people debate whether or not he actually offered her. There's a lot of people that don't like my assessment of that. I think that he did. I think the text is pretty clear that he did. The people have a lot of trouble with that. They say, no, he didn't really offer her as a burnt offering. He just gave her to the temple service. But nothing about this story says that to me. Not only does it say that he did what he vowed, it goes on to say that perpetually in Israel for a week, the women memorialized this event after that. We're 24 years from the September 11th attacks. People do not watch the memorial ceremonies anymore. People do not go to them anymore. People only remember that it's the memorial of the day when they turn the news on that night. And we barely made it a decade. Okay, the text here says that they did this every year. This was a great, shocking event. And so I'm personally persuaded that the text means that he did what he said. And that is as heinous as it comes. And we're going to get into the actual verses of the law that say what he should have done and how to rectify the problem that he was in properly. So he actually made two mistakes. He made the rash vow, and then he responded to the rash vow in the wrong way. So that's swearing unintentionally by God's name or to God. And then verse 17 in this context offers a fourth issue. If a person sins and does any of the things which the Lord has uh, which the Lord has commanded not to be done, though he was unaware, still he's guilty, shall bear his punishment. So we've got you've got a prohibition from God, and you do it anyway, even if it's because you're not aware of the law. There's no excuse to be not aware of the law. The law's been given. The law was written down. They had access to it. It was read. It could be read. This all applies to us as well. We really don't have an excuse. We really can't say, wow, I never realized that was right. Now, it's true that as we're reading and studying, we might come to passages and go, I never realized that that was not right. But that is a reflection of our shortcomings. And it doesn't mean that our guilt is any less real. So we have guilt that comes upon us for transgressions, even when they are unintentional or unknown. Yes, sir. College teachers, when the students complain, it's in the syllabus. It's there. It was there. I gave it to you the first day class. We even spent a whole class period going over it. Maybe two. What always gets me is dates are in the syllabus, like when this project is due, and it's repeated like 9,000 times as the semester goes on, and then the day arrives and the student comes in and says, can I have some more time? Yeah. So you know that it happens. Shouldn't, but it does. And the fact of the matter is we bear the consequence of that. So that tells us a lot of things. And so we've got several different categories of things. Okay, my failure to act when I've been asked to is where he starts. So in this case, the authorities are saying, hey, we need information, and I have information, but I don't give it. My unintentional, unplanned, maybe even unknown touching of something that's unclean. My making a rash vow without thinking through the consequences of it. Then all of a sudden, I'm faced with the consequences of the vow. What do? Is the fact that I didn't think about that an excuse? Does it relieve me of my guilt to simply say, oh, well, I never even imagined it would be my daughter? Or failing to listen to a command of God. And it's put in the negative in verse 17, so God has commanded not to do something and you do it. So we've got sins of omission and we've got sins of commission, both talked about in this list in this chapter. Both things that we don't do and things that we do. Covered. Things that are really thought sins, like the vow, and things that are physical sins, like the touching of the unclean thing. So it's basically, in my opinion, the setup of these four things is creating bookends or boundaries that's saying from this extreme to this extreme. From a rash thought to an unthought behavior. From something that you do to something that you don't do. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that it was unintentional. It doesn't matter that it was unknown at the time. It doesn't matter that none of that matters. The law was the law. What you did not appreciate the law, and you are guilty, which is, by the way, why these things are talked about as being guilt offerings. We have to understand that there is a difference between guilt and judgment. If guilt is not addressed, judgment comes because of the guilt. Because I escaped judgment does not mean that I was not guilty. It doesn't matter if it's just a lack of knowledge that makes me escape judgment. It doesn't matter if it's a lack of intention. It doesn't matter if it's whatever. Just because the guilt is still guilty. However, you can respond appropriately to guilt and be delivered from the judgment. Which is why, for instance, Paul speaks of himself as being the chief of sinners. After he's forgiven, he's in Christ, he knows who he's believed in, he's entrusted his soul to him, he's completely convinced that on the other side of death, he is going to go to be with the Lord. He has no questions about the fact that he is not going to be judged. At the same time, he can say that I am the chief of sinners. And if God can save me and forgive me, then there's nobody that can't be saved. He recognizes the guilt, but he's been delivered from the judgment. So he recognizes the difference between being made righteous and being righteous, which are two different things as well. If you're righteous, you are by nature right. If you're made righteous, God acts to alleviate the consequences of your guilt. What is the wages of sin? Death. Guilty people deserve death. We can escape that. And this is a shadow of how we escape that that's being talked about here. Okay? The blood of bulls and goats, never able to take away sin, never able to atone for anything, never able to alleviate anything, but in shadow, pointing forward to an ultimate sacrifice that was sufficient to take away the sins of the whole world. This is what they had to do. To instruct them over centuries, to give them regular, I'm going to go out on a limb and say daily, every day there were sacrifices being offered. To give them daily instruction that there is a sacrifice on the horizon that is going to atone for the sins of man. You need to be looking for this sacrifice. Now, they didn't have the means of identifying exactly who that is at this point. There's a lot of teaching that has to take place. That was the purpose of the prophets, right? Who came to them continually and gave them bits of information, more and more information about how to identify who that would be. Or maybe I should say what that would be. At this point, they may not have even known what it would be. But the prophets informed them that it would be someone from Judah, from the tribe of Judah, that it would be someone from Bethlehem, born of a virgin, that it would be someone who spent time in Egypt, that you can just go down the list. There were little pieces of information that were supplied by the prophets in the ensuing time to tell them what it was they were looking for, but they had these things every time they transgressed to remind them that their sin cost something. That there is no victimless sin. It's really popular today to talk about victimless crimes, right? There is no victimless sin. When you transgress, even if you don't transgress against any human, you've transgressed against God. There is no victimless sin. Every sin is against God. So, let's talk about these offerings. You're going to hear some things that are very similar to what we studied about in the last chapter. He shall bring his guilt offering. This is now called a guilt offering. It was talked about as a sin offering in chapter 4. We're talking now about a guilt offering to the Lord for his sin. Now, it's entirely possible that you had to offer a sin offering and a guilt offering. I don't know. But he says, a guilt offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat as a sin offering. Now it calls it a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement on his behalf for his sin. Okay, it doesn't go into any detail there other than to tell you that it had to be a female and it had to be a sheep or a goat. That it was for your guilt, connected to your sin, and to effect your atonement. But if he cannot afford a lamb, then he shall bring to the Lord his guilt offering for that in which he has sinned 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a sin offering, the other for a burnt offering. All right, this is where verse 7 leads me to believe that they had to offer a sin offering and a guilt offering both. Because when he gets to the poor folks, he says, okay, understand, you don't have to bring a goat or a lamb, but you're going to have to bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons, because one of them's going to be the sin offering and one of them's going to be the guilt offering. And he shall bring them to the priest, who shall offer first that which is for the sin offering, and shall nip its head in the front of its neck, but he shall not sever it. In other words, they cut the throat of the bird. What did they do that for? To drain the blood, because these are blood offerings. And this blood has to be brought before the opening of the tent of meeting. This blood has to be put on the altar. It's got to be poured out at the base of the altar, and then this burnt offering of this dove to be offered. He shall also sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, while the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. The second he shall then prepare as a burnt offering according to the ordinance. So the priest shall make atonement on his behalf for his sin which he has committed, and it shall be forgiven him. But if his means are insufficient, before I get any further into this, any recollection anyone has of a relatively famous example of birds being offered? Joseph and Mary brought birds rather than a goat, or that tells us that they were of not high means. Jesus was not born into a powerful, wealthy family. He was born into someone that was not able to provide a goat for sacrifice. But if his means are insufficient for 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, listen, this is getting pretty bad. Doves and pigeons aren't really terribly expensive. But there's somebody out there that might not even have that. Then for his offering, for that which he has sinned, he shall bring the 10th of an ephah of fine flour for a sin offering. So this is a particular measurement of flour. He shall not put oil on it or place incense on it, for it's a sin offering. Okay, this is different. There was a grain offering that we talked about in chapter 2. that you did mix with oil and cook into an unleavened piece of bread. You had to put salt on it. You'll remember that discussion. And it had to be, he says, no, this is a burnt offering. This is not a grain offering. So you don't mix it with oil, and you don't mix incense with it, or you don't do any of those things. It's a burnt offering. He shall bring it to the priest, and the priest shall take his handful as a memorial portion and offer up the smoke on the altar with the offering of the Lord by fire. It's a sin offering. So a tenth of an ephah was so little that the priest portion was a handful, and the rest of it went to God. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin, which he has committed from one of these, and it shall be forgiven him. Then the rest shall become the priest's, like the grain offering. So there it goes. There was a process for these individuals, and this process took into account the means of people and the ability that people had to do what was being asked. But it also said that no one offered nothing. Everyone had to offer something. Look at verse 14. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if a person acts unfaithfully and sins unintentionally against the Lord's holy things, then he shall bring his guilt offering to the Lord, a ram without defect from the flock, according to your valuation in silver by shekels, in terms of the shekel of the sanctuary, for a guilt offering. Because there's a lot of technical stuff here to point out. Okay, there was temple measurements and temple silver that was more significant than common commerce. Okay, so when you went, you remember the money changers story in the New Testament? That's what the money changers did. They had the temple currency that was proper for the temple, and people would bring whatever currency they had and exchange it with them. The way they became robbers is they offered terrible exchange rates. And they took more than the valuation of what they were given back. And that's what Jesus was responding to. They were taking advantage of people who were trying to serve God. And God doesn't appreciate that. So we've got that under consideration here. He's telling you specifically that we're talking about valuations in temple currency. And that becomes important in verse 16, what that valuation is about, because there's something interesting about this. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about what the problem with the sin is. What is the sin in verse 15? I don't know what translation you're reading, Wesley, but I know it's not the ESV, so I'll go ahead and ask you, read for chapter. It is the ESV? Somebody that's not reading the ESV. All right, read verse 15 for me. Okay, stop for a second. Go back to the beginning again. What was the word that was used? If a person acts. Okay, that's good. Commits a trespass. The ESV uses what word there? A breach of faith. That's actually the phrase I was looking for. I'm actually using the NASB, and my ESV sitting right here. Breach of faith. What's a breach of faith? Okay, to break trust. So, in the things, I think it says to a breach of faith against the Lord's holy things. Now, unintentionally is in there. But what we need to understand is what a breach of trust against the Lord's holy things is. This is the best way that I can come to understand it. Could I be wrong? I guess possibly. But what I understand this is saying is, if I do not fulfill my obligations properly at the temple. Now, Here's a way that I could do that. Malachi talks about a man robbing God. How do I rob God? In your tithes and offerings. Okay, so I come up to make my tithe. I have a trust with God based in faith to give a 10th portion. What if I lie and suggest that my portion is less than what I actually owe? Okay, that's a breach of faith. But he specifies in this verse, even if it's unintentional. Okay, so if I withhold something that I promise or that I'm obligated to give, even if I don't do it intentionally, if I owe more, or if I'm obligated to do more and I do less, what if it's a decision about the value of something? What if it's a decision about whether I should give a sheep, a goat, or 2 turtle doves? And I give less than I was able to give, but I don't necessarily set out to do it. At the time I'm doing it, maybe I think it's okay. That's what he's talking about here. And notice what he says in verse 16. He shall make restitution for that which he has sinned against the holy thing. In other words, you got to give what you owe, but listen to what he says beyond that. And shall add to it a 5th part of it. What's a 5th part of it? 20%. So you got to pay back 120%. So you've shorted the Lord what you are obligated by faith to do. He says not only do you have to make the difference up, but add 20% on top of that. How important does that make being faithful? Do you notice none of these other things require restitution? None of these other things require a surcharge, a punitive penalty fee to placed on the top of them. But being unfaithful to God, he says, look, I want you to understand how important faith is. And if you breach your faith, I want you to remember that it cost something to breach your faith. How many times do we promise God that we're going to do something and then don't do it? That's what he's talking about here. What if I promise that I'm going to make a free will offering and then don't go and make it? That's what he's talking about here. What if we get into the New Testament time period and I say, I will do this if, kind of like Jephthah did, and then I don't actually do what I promised? That is a breach of faith. And he says it's serious. And he makes the point that it's serious by saying, not only do you have to live up to what you promised, but you then have to add a 5th part on top of that. So that next time, maybe you think about it more carefully and you don't make this mistake. I got to stop. We will finish up the little bit of this chapter. There's only like 2 or 3 verses left, and move into chapter 6 next time, Lord willing.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. the sun it shall never